Welcome to the June 2019 edition of SEM Wealth Management's Phishing Awareness webinar. I am Dustin Briles, SEM's Director of Technology. I wanted to start off by thanking everybody who took some time out of their day to watch this webinar, and especially if you do business with us. When it comes to security, your success is our success and vice versa. We understand that it can be hard to stay on top of security threats and best practices, and our goal here is just to make sure everyone receives some education on how to protect themselves. This webinar will be primarily concerned with phishing attacks, which are a significant threat in the finance industry and continue to get more and more sophisticated. It's not always obvious when an email is malicious, especially if you're flipping through a ton of emails every day. So we'll spend some time walking through the recent phishing simulation that we sent to our internal employees and our business partners. We'll also spend some time talking about some other security best practices and advice. If you watched our last security webinar from several months ago, this webinar will contain some of the same content, but also has a bunch of new information as well. It's definitely not just a repeat of the last one. So with all of that said, let's begin. I first want to touch on the human element of all this. Human beings tend to be the weakest link in security. And as we'll later see, phishing attacks exploit some of the inherent vulnerabilities that we possess as humans. One example to sort of drive this point is the recent Redtail breach. Redtail is a CRM that has positioned itself as a competitor to Salesforce and other popular CRMs, specifically for the finance industry. On March 4th, 2019, Redtail discovered that it was exposing sensitive information for a subset of clients in a way that anyone on the internet could access. The reason that this happened was because of an access control configuration. Actually, rather a lack of configuration. There were no technical controls to prevent unauthorized access to this data. Redtail wasn't hacked per se, no technical vulnerabilities were exploited, but the human beings that worked at Redtail did not properly secure this data by properly implementing access controls. Computers generally do exactly as they're told, for better or worse, but humans can be persuaded to go against protocol, not follow procedures, and can miss things that turn out to be really important. These are vulnerabilities that we possess as human beings. The main topic of this webinar, phishing, is a type of attack that exploits human vulnerabilities. Let's look at that now. It might be helpful if we begin by defining social engineering, which phishing is a subset of. Social engineering refers to exploitation of human beings by using deception. This usually involves things like false trust, misinformation, a sense of urgency, and threats. Some examples of this might be if you were to convince someone to hold open a door to an employees only area of a store because you're holding a bunch of boxes and can't get the door yourself, obviously, but even though you're not an employee, they might let you through. You could also send a realistic looking share file email to a bunch of people and hope that they click on the link in the malicious email that you included. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with such a thing. And there's also the classic example of the Trojan horse. During the mythological Trojan War, the Greek army gave the city of Troy a large wooden horse as a peace offering. The Trojans opened their gates and brought in the horse, not knowing that the horse had been hollowed out and was holding a number of skilled Greek soldiers who would soon pop out of the horse and capture the city. As you might have guessed, phishing with a PH is a play on the word fishing with an F. It's a type of social engineering that is designed to catch information or access that you wouldn't normally be able or allowed to get. Though email is the most common attack vector, phishing attacks can be conducted using plenty of other methods of communication too, over the phone, the postal system, or even in person. There are actually a number of categories of phishing attacks. Here's a brief list. There's regular phishing, which is when you send out a ton of emails with the same sort of template. You're playing a numbers game here. If you send your email to enough people, you're bound to get a few bites. Because of this, these emails are typically easier to spot because compared to something like spear phishing, which we'll look at soon, attackers typically don't put as much effort into making it look legitimate because again, you're playing a numbers game. And then there's spear phishing. This is a targeted attack sent to a relatively small number of people. When you run a spear phishing campaign, you've done your homework and you conduct your attack with a higher degree of precision. Consequently, the emails and websites probably look quite a bit more convincing in this kind of attack. There's also whaling, which could be considered a type of spear phishing attack, but specifically aimed at high-value targets. This could mean people with a lot of money, but it could also mean members of a company's board of directors, for instance. Phishing refers to any type of phishing attack that is conducted using a phone call. If you combine the words voice and phishing, you get vishing. And then there's smishing, which is similar to vishing, but the attacks are carried out using text messages, which are also known as SMS messages. If you combine the words SMS and phishing, you get smishing. In the interest of clarity, here are two quick examples of real phishing attacks. This is an email pretending to be from Office 365, claiming that you have some unread messages. Notice that in some places the attacker substituted the letter M with the letters R and N put together, which sort of looks like an M if you don't pay too much attention. If you were to click on the Read the Message link, you would be taken to a fake Office 365 login page that is designed to capture your username and password and then send them to an attacker. And here's an excerpt from an article which describes a phishing attack that took place over a phone call, which, if you remember, is called vishing. The victim here describes an attacker who called the victim and used specific information to try and solicit more personal information from the victim, which the attacker would then go on to use to make fraudulent purchases on the victim's credit card. Phishing attacks that take place over email are definitely the most common, but clearly the threat of vishing attacks should not be ignored either. Now that you know what phishing is and have seen some examples, let's talk about why phishing is such a serious threat. If you used the internet 10, 15, 20 years ago, you probably remember some phishing emails along the lines of the Crown Prince of Nigeria wanting to send you money because it turns out you're somehow part of his bloodline. Just click a link and give out your bank account number. Or your long-lost cousin, who you've never met, needs money and wants you to rush down to your local Western Union and send him a money order. These seem pretty silly now. However, as we've gotten better at recognizing these kind of phishing attacks, the level of sophistication used in phishing attacks has also increased, sort of like an arms race. One thing that has not changed is human beings are generally still pretty vulnerable to social engineering, and attackers still know this. Let's look at some statistics. Verizon generates an annual report about security breaches. This report uses data that comes from incidents that Verizon has investigated itself and data that is provided from external contributors. The 2019 report was released recently, and the following statistics are pulled from this report. Many of you who are watching this webinar work for a small business somewhere in the finance sector. If so, this should put some things into perspective. A common thing that I hear from small businesses is that they're not a significant target for cybercriminals. They cite various reasons, including that they don't have as much money as quote-unquote bigger companies. Their internet presence is much more limited compared to bigger companies, and it's much easier to gather information on bigger companies and plenty of other reasons as well. However, according to this report from Verizon, 43% of the breaches involved small businesses. Clearly, small businesses are a target. 71% of breaches were financially motivated, meaning that the attackers are looking to profit financially from their attack. If you work in the finance industry, this should concern you. In fact, in financially motivated social engineering attacks, which are mostly phishing attacks, the finance industry experienced the third largest number of incidents, behind the healthcare and professional services industries. The report also has a list of what it calls common action asset combinations. An action asset combination just refers to a specific kind of attack, the action, against a specific thing, the asset. The second most common action asset combination, according to this report, was phishing attacks against email servers. This definitely aligns with what we have seen at SEM recently, especially. Most of the phishing emails that we receive are fake Office 365 login pages. There's a good reason for this. If you hack your way into a legitimate email account, you can then exploit the trust that other people have in that email address by using that email account to send more phishing emails. And as a victim, you're much more likely to click a link in an email that comes from your coworkers or a business partner's legitimate email address than from someone you don't know. So General phishing statistics are nice, but I think it might be helpful to look at a more depth example of a specific phishing incident. In 2018, the U.S. Department of Justice formally charged 9 Iranians with conducting a quote-unquote massive cyber theft campaign on behalf of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a branch of Iran's armed forces. These 9 Iranians were apparently responsible for stealing 31 terabytes of information from over 300 universities and various other public and private entities. It is estimated that the value of the intellectual property that was stolen is somewhere around $3 billion. Many of the intrusions in this campaign started with successful spear phishing attacks. This means that a bunch of human beings received emails that were fake, but apparently appeared to be real enough, and then they clicked links inside those emails. The victims were probably then directed to a fake login page, which looked like their company's or university's login portal, and entered their usernames and passwords, effectively handing that information to the Iranian hackers. From there, the hackers themselves logged in with the stolen usernames and passwords and went about their business of stealing information. The interesting thing here is that you might expect hackers working on behalf of the Iranian military to have some serious skill and access to significant resources to complete a job like that. After all, they did break into over 300 universities. These hackers probably did have those things, but we also know that in many cases they did not need those advanced skills and resources. They just needed to launch phishing attacks. There was no need for crazy exploits against complicated server vulnerabilities. They just tricked people into handing over their usernames and passwords. This is an illustration of how effective phishing can be, especially at scale, because vulnerable human beings mean that you don't need super technical and sophisticated attacks to break in. Another thing that I would say is it might be tempting to think that regulatory agencies, such as the SEC or FINRA, would cut you some slack if your small business experienced data breach from attackers with the backing of Iran's military. However, you should know that there are public documents describing an incident at a small business involving hackers from a hostile country, and that the SEC did not gloss over it. RT Jones Capital Equities Management is a registered investment advisor who, in 2015, had about $480 million in assets under management. Though the SEC categorizes this as a quote-unquote large advisory firm, RT Jones last reported that they have 7 employees, which I think firmly qualifies it as a small business. In July 2013, a web server run by RT Jones was attacked and, long story short, the attacker or attackers gained access to the personal information for a lot of people. I don't know if you can see it in the article there, but it was about 100,000 people. Obviously, the SEC was notified, and they ended up finding that RT Jones did not adequately implement, quote, policies and procedures reasonably designed to safeguard the security and confidentiality of client financial records and information, end quote. For those of you familiar, this translates to a violation of Rule 30A in Regulation SP, otherwise known as the Safeguards Rule. Here are some notable facts about this situation. The hackers that broke into the web server were from China. There was never any hard evidence that information was actually taken from the web server, just that unauthorized Chinese hackers accessed the web server and might have stolen information. RT Jones appears to have responded to the incident totally appropriately. Immediately following their discovery of the unauthorized access, they 1. Hired several third-party cybersecurity firms to investigate, 2. Notified each individual whose information may have been compromised and offered them free identity monitoring, and 3. Totally revamped their cybersecurity program, including appointing an information security manager, removing sensitive information from the web server, implementing a written information security policy, installing a firewall and logging system to prevent and detect future attacks, and retaining a cybersecurity firm to provide ongoing reports and advice on RT Jones's cybersecurity program, which is a pretty robust response to such an incident. Ultimately, the SEC decided to issue 3 sanctions against RT Jones. 1. The SEC ordered that RT Jones cease and desist from committing violations of the Safeguards Rule. 2. The SEC censured RT Jones over the incident, which is basically a strong reprimand publicly. And 3. The SEC fined RT Jones $75,000. It should also be noted that the SEC explicitly stated that RT Jones's positive actions following the breach affected the sanctions that they issued. In other words, RT Jones did everything right after the incident happened, but this was only enough to make the consequences less severe, not remove them. Also, this says nothing about the damage to RT Jones's reputation or how many customers they lost as a result. There were some other aspects of this incident that may have contributed to the SEC's decision to publicly reprimand RT Jones, but unfortunately, I don't have time to get into that right now. I also didn't read anything that specified if the attackers gained access to the web server through a phishing attack or if it was some other weakness, but that's not really the point here. The takeaway is that even if hackers are from a hostile country, even if you do everything right after the fact, you are not immune from the consequences of poor cybersecurity hygiene. Good cybersecurity hygiene includes exercising some discretion and caution before clicking links in emails. And on that note, let's take a look at the recent phishing simulation that we conducted against our internal employees and business partners. We'll start with a real email. This is an email notification from ShareFile, which is a service that you can use to securely share files with people. There's a feature in ShareFile that will, when a file is added or modified within a folder, send an email notification to everyone who has access to that folder. This makes it easy to notify your business partners, for instance, when you have added or updated some documents relevant to them. But it also presents an opportunity for phishing. Let's contrast this with the fake email that we sent out as part of the phishing simulation. I'll give you a second to look at this. I know that some of our business partners often check email on their phones, so here's the same email in the Outlook for iOS app, which will look almost identical to the Outlook for Android app. You've probably already spotted some differences between the real and fake emails, but let's compare them side by side. The fake email is probably a little more convincing this time than in the previous phishing simulations that we've conducted, because it does contain some legitimate information. It has the word ShareFile, SEM Wealth Management, Citrix, all spelled correctly, and its formatting is very similar to the real email. So this is more of a spear phishing attack than a general phishing attack. It targeted specific people, and clearly the attacker had some specific knowledge about who to send it to and what a legitimate ShareFile notification email looks like. Remember, this is the same category of attack that, in part, was used to break into over 300 universities last year. This phishing simulation was sent to people who have probably previously received a real ShareFile notification email. So anyone that received this phishing email should have noticed some key differences, at least enough to be suspicious. There are also a few things about the fake email in itself that should have raised some red flags. Let's take a closer look at those. We'll start with the from address. One thing that you could notice is that the email address was different than the normal email address that ShareFile notifications come from. Certainly, it is possible for ShareFile to change where they send emails from, but nonetheless, this is one thing to consider. Another thing is the display name, and this is a common tactic with phishing emails. When you send an email, you have the option of specifying a display name along with your email address, though this is normally done for you automatically by your email client or email provider. For example, the first image is what an email that comes from technology@semwealth.com looks like normally. The display name was automatically set to SEM Technology. The second image shows an email where I manually set the display name to Shaggy Rogers in an attempt to make that email look like it came from Scooby-Doo's best friend, instead of where it actually came from, technology@semwealth.com. Something notable about this is that the display name is shown in front of the actual email address, making it easier to hide a malicious-looking email address. On top of that, in certain views, by default, your email client may only show you the display name. So you can see that you can hide the actual email address pretty effectively in certain cases. Unlike the email address, there's not really any standard technical way to validate a display name, because despite everything that we just saw, it's not actually meant to be something that carries any real authority. The good news here is that you can always reveal the actual email address. If you've opened the email and you still can't see the from address, usually you just have to click or tap on the display name and it will appear. The pictures here show how that works in Outlook for iOS, but you can do this in the desktop version of Outlook as well, and in Outlook for Android. Looking at this comparison again, you can see that we certainly used the display name trick here to try and make the fake email seem a little more legitimate. You'll notice that in this case, the real email doesn't even have a display name. The third thing to notice about the from address is the domain name itself. This is the part of the email address that comes after the @ symbol. The domain of the email address in the real email is sf-notifications.com, and for the fake email, it was semwealth-sharefile.com. Now, again, everyone who received this phishing email should have previously received a legitimate ShareFile email, and so you should have been familiar with the fact that these emails normally come from sf-notifications.com. That's flag number 1. Before we get into flag number 2, we need to learn a little bit about how domains work. In a domain, there are different levels separated by dots or periods. As an example, let's use the domain robert-paulson.com. In this domain, there are 2 domain levels separated by the dot. In this case, com is what we call the top level domain, and robert-paulson is the second level domain. The second level domain is the important part here. It's the part that you really get to choose when you buy and register a domain. For example, SEM has registered semwealth.com and whatsmyscore.net. With this knowledge, let's take another look at the domain involved in the phishing email. Based on what we just learned, you should be able to identify com as the top level domain and semwealth-sharefile as the second level domain. This is where the deception is. We just learned that it's the dot or period that separates different levels of a domain, but this domain makes use of a hyphen to make it look like it's the semwealth subdomain under sharefile.com. Really, as part of this attack, I went out and bought semwealth-sharefile.com. As an attacker, I can't use semwealth.sharefile.com because I would first need to control the second level domain sharefile.com. And obviously that domain is already taken and under control by Sharefile. I also can't use sharefile.semwealth.com because I would first need to control the second level domain semwealth.com. And that domain is also already taken, speaking from the perspective of an attacker. Now, to be totally clear, as an attacker, I could try to send emails from either of those domains. In other words, spoof the domain. But if you have any sort of spam filtering, which is included with most email providers by default these days, it should detect that and send it to your junk mail or quarantine. However, I can use semwealth-sharefile.com because that is itself a second level domain, which means that as long as it's not already registered, you can go out and buy it. And that is exactly what I did. Before launching the phishing campaign, I went out and bought that domain, knowing that it looks very similar to semwealth.sharefile.com. And then I could use this fact to my advantage, tricking people into believing that the email sent from this domain was legitimate email from the semwealth Sharefile account. I'm not spoofing anything here. I just bought a domain that happens to look like a completely unrelated domain. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, man, that is a dirty trick, you should know that I agree with you, but you should also know that we didn't do this just to be mean. It's a technique that real phishing attacks use all the time. Check this out. Here's a screenshot from a list of domains that have been previously registered and confirmed to be used in phishing attacks. As you can see, plenty of domains have been registered that use the same hyphen technique to make it appear as though they have some legitimate association with PayPal, even though the domains have nothing to do with the real PayPal. So, regarding the domain name in the phishing email, red flag number 1 was that the domain is totally different than what you see in normal, legitimate Sharefile emails. Red flag number 2 is that the domain has a hyphen in a place where you would normally see a dot in legitimate domains, in an attempt to make it look like it has a legitimate association with semwealth and Sharefile. This is not a guarantee that the email is fake. You can see that the domain in the real email uses the hyphen in a sort of similar way, but this is the exception rather than the rule. So you should, by default, be wary of domains that use hyphens to try and convey a legitimate relationship or association like this. Now, the combination of both of these red flags should really have raised your suspicions, and as we're about to see, there's more about this email that should cause you to raise an eyebrow. Let's continue working our way down the fake email. We just looked at the from address, now let's look at the body of the email. ShareFile has a feature that will insert our company logo and a blue bar at the top of every notification email that comes from our ShareFile account. If you don't see this in a ShareFile email that is claiming to have an association with SEM Wealth Management, one of two things is probably happening. Either one, the email is not legitimate, or two, you have not downloaded the pictures in the email. Now, not downloading pictures automatically is actually a good security practice, and I would recommend that everyone configure their email clients to not automatically download pictures. However, if you normally do see that logo right off the bat, but suddenly in one particular email you don't, you should take some more time to consider the legitimacy of that email. Another thing to notice in the body is the nature of the content. As you can see in the real email, and if you get ShareFile emails from us, you'll know this, there's a bunch of really specific information here that I can't even share publicly, and it's blurred out. Contrast that with the fake email, which just has a generic reference to client information and client files and updated. Well, which client? We wouldn't just upload a PDF file and call it client information because that gives almost no information about what would actually be in that file. And we usually try to be pretty helpful when sending information to our business partners. So you have to use context clues here. And even if an attacker has the necessary information to conduct a spear phishing attack, it's much less likely that they will also have so much more specific information about you or your clients. Because if they did, it's likely that they wouldn't even need to be conducting a spear phishing attack. They would already have what they need. Honestly, the best thing to do if you get an email that you are unsure about is go to the website yourself manually. In the case of ShareFile, anybody that needs it should have our ShareFile URL. And if you get a notification from our ShareFile account telling you that you have a new file ready to download, you can go straight to the website and log in without clicking any links in any emails. If you bookmark it or have a password manager, which you should be using anyway, this should expedite the whole process so that it's only negligibly slower to click the link in the email anyway. And if you're using a password manager, the whole process of going to the website and logging in probably takes less time than clicking the link and entering your username and password manually. However, there may be circumstances that require you to click the link anyway. Sometimes the thing that you're trying to get to is on a website that you've never been to before, or you don't remember the web address and you didn't bookmark it, or it's a URL that changes all the time, or plenty of other reasons. If you're feeling iffy about an email where you feel that you do not have any choice but to click on the link, you can take a closer look at where that link actually goes before you click it. In Outlook and other popular email clients, if you hover your mouse over the link, a pop-up will appear with the link's address. As you can see here, the link in the email takes us to a website that is hosted behind that same deceptive domain that we talked about earlier when we looked at the from address in the email, semwealth-sharefile.com. Sometimes the link is really long though, or it's hard to read, or maybe you just want to take a closer look at it for any other reason. In these cases, you can right-click on the link, click Copy Hyperlink, and then paste it into a text editor such as Word or Notepad, and take a closer look. This makes it a little easier to identify a suspicious-looking domain. You can also do this on your mobile device. Usually you just have to long press on the link and you'll be given an option to copy it, which you can then paste elsewhere and take a closer look. As you can see in this picture, in Outlook for iOS, you are also shown the link text as soon as the long press menu comes up. So let's sum up the things that we just went over. These points should serve as good general guidance for dealing with potential phishing emails in the future as well. The first thing that you should consider is your gut feeling? Does the email feel off? Is something different compared to emails that you normally get of the same nature? If so, take a closer look. Is the display name trying to hide a more malicious looking email address? What is the second level domain in the from address? Does it have anything to do with the company or person that the email is supposedly coming from? Does it match previous emails from that company or person? Does it use hyphens to try and trick you into thinking it's legitimate? What about the content of the email? Does it make sense for you to be receiving this email under these circumstances with this content? Can you log into the website yourself and completely bypass any links in the email entirely? And if you are at all suspicious, you can always ask a coworker what their opinion is, or contact the supposed source company or person and ask them about the email. There's nothing wrong with this, and some of our business partners have reached out to us in the past to verify the legitimacy of various emails, including some from ShareFile. However, I definitely don't recommend replying directly to the suspicious email itself. If it is malicious, there's nothing stopping the bad guy on the other end from replying with, "Yes, of course this is legitimate." And if there is an attacker on the other end, you've just confirmed that you have opened and read the email, which may invite the attacker to come after you with more persistence. So verifying the legitimacy of an email is really important. I know that some of you are probably thinking that, well, as long as you don't enter your username and password on the fake login page, it doesn't really matter if you click the link in the email or not. Well, that's not always true. Consider this bit of news from just last week. Last Thursday, Ars Technica reported on a phishing campaign that was using a zero-day exploit in Firefox web browsers running on Mac computers. Zero-day exploit basically refers to any exploit that is either unknown to or has not yet been patched by the company who makes the product. Basically, a zero-day exploit will work against a computer even if it is completely up to date on security patches. With this particular phishing campaign, all you had to do was click the link in the phishing email, and then your computer was compromised. Also, at the time that this report was written, about a week ago, most antivirus software did not even detect the malware. This particular attack was limited to Mac computers running the Firefox web browser, but this is just one example of a long list of ways that you can get compromised just by clicking on a link. So we know that clicking the link in a phishing email can be enough to get you into some trouble. But what if you do end up on the phishing page anyway, either from an email link or from some other reason? Maybe you got redirected there from somewhere else. If the phishing campaign that you have interacted with was not designed to compromise you just by clicking on the link, the phishing page is your last stop before giving the attacker what they want. Let's use the phishing site that SEM built for this phishing simulation as an example of what to look for. Here's what the real login page looks like to get into SEM Wealth Management's ShareFile account. You'll notice that I blurred a portion of the URL too. Though this web page is publicly accessible and most of the people on this webinar probably already know how to get to that page, this webinar is public, the recorded version will be public, and I don't want to just throw this information out there. If someone with malicious intentions really wanted to figure out how to get here, they probably could, but I would rather err on the side of caution. So with that being said, let's contrast this with the fake login page that you would have seen if you clicked the link in our fake phishing email. Normally, one of the first red flags that you should notice on a phishing site is how the site looks. You could even open a new browser tab, go to what you know is the real website, and compare the two. For this campaign, I put some effort into making sure that our fake site looked fairly legitimate, but there are still some differences that I think are in line with what you might see in a real phishing attack. Let's start by contrasting the content of the real and fake web pages. The first thing to notice is, like in the email, our logo and the blue strip are missing from the fake site. Instead, the fake site has the generic ShareFile logo, and again, no blue strip underneath the address bar. Same thing is true if you look at the web pages in a mobile browser. These differences by themselves are not guarantees that a web page is fake, but again, the key here is that if the web page normally looks a certain way, and then suddenly one day it's different, this should cause you to stop and think for a second before entering your sensitive information. The next thing to notice is that there are some things missing from the login form. You can see here that the fake login page is missing the links for privacy policy and forgot password. The missing forgot password link is the most significant of the two in my opinion, because most legitimate websites would want to have an easily accessible password reset process. Again, the same is true on mobile sites. Other than the content, you should have also noticed the domain in the URL. Just like the email, there are two things to note about the phishing domain here. It is different than the normal ShareFile domain that you see when logging into the legitimate website. And two, it's got the hyphen thing going on, which we looked at during our examination of the email. This too should immediately raise your suspicions. Remember, the dot is what separates different levels of a domain, not the hyphen. And here you can see the difference in a mobile browser. Mobile browsers actually make it a little easier to identify the domain as long as it's not too long. You can see that it cut off everything after the slash and it shows you just the domain. If you use a password manager, you should definitely have noticed one really important thing. You can see on the fake web page, my password manager did not have any suggestions for a username or a password to use. But on the real website, it did. And in fact, it autofilled my username and password for me. And in a lot of cases, it'll log in for me as well. Your password manager is probably much better than you are at noticing that the website's domain is different than what it normally is or what it should be. That's what happened here with my password manager, and consequently, it did not autofill or suggest any credentials on the fake website. This should have immediately raised your suspicion. Another technique that attackers can use is to add subdomains under the second level domain that they registered to try and make the URL seem more legitimate. Now here's an example from our last phishing simulation where I did that exact thing. So this is not from the simulation we just did, but I think it's an important point. You can see that in the fake URL, the second level domain is com-liberty.com, which is definitely not associated with any legitimate company, much less Trust Company of America. After you register a second level domain, you can add subdomains under it with complete freedom. You can see here that for the fake website, I created app.trustamerica under com-liberty.com, which makes it appear more legitimate, but again, don't be fooled. Pay attention to that second level domain. As an example, just as easily, I could have created paypal.secure.com-liberty.com just as easily, and of course, it would have had nothing to do with the real PayPal site. One more URL or domain trick that I think you should be aware of is sometimes attackers will gain access to the administrative side of an existing legitimate website and host their phishing page there. This utilizes some of the SEO, legitimacy, and trust that the real website has already established, so it's less likely to be categorized as spam and also has the domain of a real legitimate website that is normally used for legitimate purposes right there in the address bar. The tip-off with this technique is that the domain usually has nothing to do with the content. You can see here that the web page is trying to spoof an Office 365 login page, but the domain is tangerineluxurycamp.com, which is obviously not where any sort of real Office 365 login page would live. One thing that may have confused you is that padlock symbol. After all, it was there on the fake website, and many of us have been told that the padlock symbol does mean secure. If you click on it, it'll actually show you a message that says secure as well. Unfortunately, it does not mean secure in the way that you are probably thinking, and I know that that seems probably intuitive. It means that your connection to that site is encrypted, and in that sense, your connection to the website is secure. This encryption is a good thing, and we should always be encouraging websites to use it, but it doesn't mean that the website itself is safe. If you submit your username and password on a phishing page that has the padlock symbol, it means that your username and password are encrypted in transit all the way to the attacker's server. So sure, no one else on the internet will be able to see your username and password because it's encrypted, but that hardly matters when you just sent them directly to an attacker. So beware of this. You may hear people that tell you that the padlock symbol means secure, but you need to understand what secure actually means in this context. On the flip side, one thing that might tip you off is if the website didn't have the padlock symbol, especially on a login page or any other page where sensitive information is submitted. And at least in Google Chrome, unencrypted sites will show the phrase not secure where the padlock symbol would be. We also have a post on the SEM technology blog that gives this topic a little more attention. You can get there by browsing to techblog.semwealth.com. Let's sum up the things you should look for when identifying a phishing website. First, how does the website look? Does the content look off or different compared to what you were expecting? Are there misspelled words, broken images, shifted images, or other suspicious differences between it and the website that you were expecting to see? Check the URL. Is the domain the same as what you normally see for this page? Does the second level domain look suspicious? Does it match the content of the website? Remember, attackers can also host phishing pages on legitimate websites that they have somehow broken into. But these legitimate websites usually have nothing to do with the content on the phishing page. Use the password manager. We'll talk more about them in a minute, but as you saw, my password manager did not autofill or suggest any credentials for the fake website, and it normally does on the real website. The padlock symbol does not mean that a web page is safe. It means that your connection to the website is encrypted, which does nothing for you when the site itself is malicious. In fact, according to a study conducted in December 2018 by Phish Labs, about half of all phishing sites use encryption and have that padlock symbol. And that percentage has probably increased in the last 6 months. And on a related note, the FBI just released an advisory telling people to stop trusting websites just because they have a padlock. Just like with emails, do not be afraid to ask someone about the legitimacy of a website. So this brings us to the end of this segment of the webinar where we went over the phishing simulation that SEM conducted recently. To finish up, I'd like to go over a few pieces of general security advice that I'm hoping will be helpful for everyone. We've all been guilty of reusing passwords across multiple websites, but honestly, this has got to stop. Attackers know that because we have tens and even hundreds of online accounts to log into, humans do tend to reuse passwords, and they use this fact to engage in a type of attack known as credential stuffing. Credential stuffing works by leveraging the fact that there are a ton of lists containing valid usernames and valid passwords floating around the back alleys of the internet. These lists contain usernames and passwords that are gathered from existing data breaches, and also by generating large lists of what attackers know are commonly used passwords. As an example, you may remember that LinkedIn was hacked back in 2012. One result of that hack is that every account that was part of that data breach had its username and password dumped into a list. And if you use the same password on LinkedIn as you did somewhere else, anyone could go grab that list, find your username and password, and start trying to log into a bunch of websites until they get into one. Now, because hackers are pretty crafty, this process can be automated using a bunch of different lists that contain a bunch of different usernames and passwords, and they can launch that against a ton of different websites. And they can even account for variations of the same password, by the way. So don't think that just changing the last character or adding an extra exclamation point at the end is going to save you here. Since most of us are ShareFile users, you may remember late last year when they forced a password reset on everybody. The reason ShareFile did this is that they detected a large number of login attempts that looked like credential stuffing. ShareFile didn't get hacked themselves, but attackers were still getting into a bunch of ShareFile accounts because people either, one, reused their ShareFile password in some other place, which was hacked and then got on a list somewhere, or two, they just had a generally terrible password. And in either case, that password ended up on a list somewhere, and the attackers used that list of passwords to log into a bunch of ShareFile accounts. The solution to this is to use a unique password for every website and store it in a password manager. So, sort of on this note, to get a feel for how much your data has been involved in various data breaches, you can use this website. It's called haveibeenpwned.com, and yes, that is PWNED. Just go to the website, enter in one of your email addresses, or all of them if you want, and you'll be given a list of data breaches that contain that email address, at least the ones that Have I Been Pwned knows about. You'll also be given the type of data that was included in each breach. So it'll tell you, was your address included, was your name included, was your social security included, etc. You can also sign up to get notifications whenever a new data breach is added that contains your email address. And if you have the correct permission at your company, you can also sign up to get notifications anytime that any email address at your company is involved in a data breach. So as Director of Technology at SEM, I get a notification anytime Have I Been Pwned loads a new data breach that contains data corresponding to any email address that ends in semwealth.com. Have I Been Pwned also has the ability to check if a certain password has been involved in any of the data breaches that it knows about. In other words, you can go there right now and see if there are any data breaches that contain your current passwords, which will help you figure out for which of your accounts you need to go immediately change the password to, and that should help you protect yourself from credential stuffing attacks. I don't have time in this webinar to go over how it all works at a technical level or why it's actually safe to enter your username and password on this website, but long story short, go check out the website, and if you have any questions, check out their About page, and that will answer any and all questions you have about privacy here. And I can also help answer some of your questions about this site. I'm pretty into it myself. So If you would like, you can send an email to technology@semwealth.com. So as we just talked about, you typically need tens or hundreds of accounts to do anything these days, and there's no way you can remember a unique password for every single one of those accounts. Some people have resorted to keeping their passwords in a basic Excel, Word, or other plain text file, or even writing down their passwords, keeping them on a sticky note or some other incredibly insecure place. Password managers are a fantastic alternative. A password manager is basically a vault which contains your usernames, passwords, and what website or service that they're used for. This vault is heavily encrypted and can only be accessed by using a single master password. This allows you to generate long, crazy, incredibly secure passwords for all of your websites that are totally unique, and you never have to remember a single one of them. You only need to remember the one master password to get into your password manager. Consequently, this does mean that you need to make a very good master password and that you don't give out that master password to anybody, because if somebody has it, they can log into your password manager and gain access to all of your usernames and passwords in one place, which is obviously very bad. Now, there are some additional things that you can do to protect your accounts, even if somebody does get your password, and I'll touch on those in a minute. The two password managers that I'll recommend to anybody are LastPass and 1Password. We use LastPass at SEM, but I know plenty of people have had a great experience with 1Password as well. Both are pretty cost-friendly. Both also have a free trial, and LastPass itself has an entirely free tier, which works just fine for personal use. Both are cloud solutions, which means that you can access them from anywhere, and on mobile devices too. Now, if you don't want your password stored in a cloud service, you can also use a local password manager like KeePass. I personally used KeePass for a while at a previous job before we started using LastPass. Now, the next bit of advice basically boils down to use two-factor authentication, or 2FA, wherever you can. Here's a brief explanation of two-factor authentication. So when we talk about a factor of authentication, we're referring to these three things. One, something you know. An example of this would be a password, which you know it's in your head. Two is something you have. An example of this would be a little hardware thing that generates a 6-digit code every so often, like a RSA secure ID system, if you're familiar, or an authenticator app on your phone. That's something that you physically possess. And the third one is something you are. An example of this would be your fingerprint or any other kind of biometric data, because it's part of who you are. Two-factor authentication refers to the use of two of those factors to log into something. You may have dealt with a version of this when logging into something like Instagram, Twitter, Amazon, PayPal, or something similar. You basically enter your username and password, log in, but before you're allowed into your account, a text message is sent to your cell phone with a short code that you also have to submit. Now, that's technically not true two-factor authentication, and it has its own vulnerabilities, but it is still much better than just a password. But what we're really shooting for these days are authenticator apps, which have a nice balance between security and usability. An authenticator app is an app that you usually put on your phone, and then you add your accounts that support this kind of 2FA. And this kind of 2FA is called TOTP, or time-based one-time password. Then when you go to log into one of those accounts, you have to pull up the authenticator app, get the 6-digit code that it gives you, and enter it in the login form before the code expires, which is usually within 30 seconds. In practice, this is pretty similar to the text message codes, except that you pull up an app on your phone to get the code instead of waiting for a text message. And from a technical perspective, it is a whole lot more secure than text message codes. And the good news is ShareFile supports this kind of 2FA. Unfortunately, you first have to set it up with the text message method, but after that, you can go and enable the better version of 2FA with the app on your phone. As for the authenticator apps themselves, there are a bunch to choose from. I personally like Authy, but there are plenty of others like Duo Security and Google Authenticator. Just look up Authenticator app in your phone's app store and you'll see the most common ones right away. The topic of two-factor authentication is also something that we've talked about in a post on the SEM technology blog, so feel free to check it out if you want a more thorough explanation of two-factor authentication. Before we close, I'd just like to mention something about security versus productivity. I used to work for a school district, and we conducted phishing simulations there too. I remember after one test, there was a teacher who had fallen for our fake email and was not very happy about it. This teacher later posted on social media something along the lines of, "The only thing I learned from this phishing test was to not check my emails." Now, I hope that this is not the same mindset that anyone here is in after this webinar is done, because this webinar and the phishing simulation itself are not really meant to shame anybody, but really to educate. We need to be aware that we as human beings can often be the weakest link in security, and therefore we need to be vigilant of the types of social engineering attacks that criminals are actively using to break into businesses of all sizes and across all industries. We also know that sometimes keeping up with security best practices can feel a bit like this. I'll give you a second to read that. With the huge workload and fast-paced environment that most of us deal with in the financial sector especially, it can feel like there's no way we could keep up with security best practices, even if we do stop watching cat videos. So on the other hand, sometimes reality is more like this. Sometimes we get complacent with security and end up paying for it. And that's not good either, because nobody wants to be J.R. Smith at the end of Game 1 of last year's NBA Finals. Like many things in life, it's about balance. You can have good security without compromising too much efficiency. Some examples that we went over in this webinar include, rather than clicking the links directly in emails, go directly to the website itself. You can use bookmarks to help make this faster, and even better would be a password manager, which, like a bookmark, can take you directly to the correct login page, but it can also autofill your username and password and potentially even log you in automatically. And the added benefit is that you can easily make all of your passwords totally unique. Password managers are one piece of technology that actually improves both security and efficiency. Now, there are some times where your only option is to click the link in the email. In these cases, if you're feeling unsure, you can always inspect the link yourself, or ask a coworker for their opinion, or ask the assumed sender of the email if they really sent that email. Two-factor authentication is also a really, really good idea, because it means that even if your password is compromised, an attacker would still need your temporary 6-digit code to log in. This does require some compromise in terms of time to get into your accounts, but the extra 10 to 15 seconds that it may take to log in is, I think, absolutely worth the upgrade in security. And one last thing, I threw this slide in sort of last minute, but I thought it might be important and definitely relevant to what we're talking about. Earlier in the webinar, we talked about a phishing incident from last year that involved 9 Iranian hackers. And now it turns out that the Iranians are again stepping up the level of cyber hostility against the United States' public and private sectors. You guys may have seen the news last week about the US military drone that was shot down near Iran. Politics aside, it has been confirmed by both the Department of Homeland Security and independent security firms that there was a rise of malicious cyber activity from Iran against the US around and immediately following that drone incident. And the implication is that the level of malicious activity has been sustained and is not likely to drop off as tensions continue to increase between us and Iran. Advisory from the DHS specifically mentions that this cyber activity often are attacks that utilize spear phishing and credential stuffing, both of which we talked about during this webinar. And to be clear, Iran is not the only source of malicious cyber from a hostile country or which hostile country they're from. The best thing to do, honestly, is just make sure you take cybersecurity seriously. One last point, sort of related to this, you may remember earlier I also mentioned that the hackers didn't really need huge resources or crazy hacker skills to launch phishing attacks. And I really did mean that. For reference, the total cost to conduct this phishing campaign that we sent out internally and against our business partners was $11.08. Now, that's the total cost for infrastructure, everything. I guess you could include my time in there, which is hard to put a price on in terms of raw numbers like this. But I can tell you, regardless, that I spent way more time working on this webinar than I did building and launching the actual phishing campaign. You really don't need a ton of resources to launch phishing campaigns. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. We've gone over a ton of information today, and thank you for sticking with me through it all. I'll try and summarize everything that we went through. First is phishing is a big deal, and you're not immune from the attacks or the consequences of those attacks just because you're a small business. You need to think critically. Don't just go through the motions when you're working in your email. This is one of the things that attackers are counting on. Make sure you pay special attention to the email address and URLs involved in any suspicious looking emails. These are good indicators if something is fishy with the PH. If you're pressed for time, use Bookmark or a password manager just to bypass the links entirely. Also, close your technical gaps. Some of the most important ways to do this are: don't reuse passwords. You will become the victim of a credential stuffing attack one day if you reuse your passwords. The second is do use a password manager. They're cheap and make it easy to use complete unique passwords everywhere and will autofill your username and password for you. And also enable 2FA, two-factor authentication, everywhere you can. As I mentioned, ShareFile has this available, but also enable it in your personal accounts too, even if it is just a text message-based version, which is still far better than nothing. And I know that I wasn't able to cover every nuance of all the topics we went through, or even all the topics that we probably would have liked to go through, but there's just so much information that we could cover here. In the future, we will continue to do webinars and add content to the SEM technology blog, which you can get there at techblog.semwealth.com. If you have any specific questions, feel free to contact me directly at technology@semwealth.com. So thanks again to everybody who's been a part of this webinar, and we hope it was educational for you all. We'll see you sometime soon, and thanks again.